just wanted to take everyone back to the engagement that we have as human beings with marine systems, right? We have evidences of humans consuming seafood from as many as 16,000 years ago. We have evidences of hunting or harpooning from more than 11,000 years ago. And over a period of time, the human being and marine systems have gone through the whole cycle of colonizing, exploring, research, and so on and so forth. And over time, we have built very strong social and cultural ties with the system. And that is something which is very important for us to keep in mind all the time, right? It's not an alien system to us. We've been a part of it for a long, long time. But before understanding the ecology and before understanding the ecosystems and the species that we find, I just wanted to sort of zoom out a little bit and look at marine systems as a whole from a more global perspective. So, across geological timescales, with the as the Earth has sort of evolved from a one supercontinent to multiple continents, and the constant interactions between the Earth, the Moon, the Sun, and the rotation of all these planetary bodies, we have the ocean, which is an extremely dynamic system, right? Where we have a network of currents, we have tides, waves, so on and so forth. And in this process, the ocean kind of regulates most of the things that happen on the planet, right? The ocean regulates temperature, the ocean regulates productivity, precipitation, sedimentation, and all these things together are what influence or what structure the marine systems the way we see today. Yeah. So, to just
Sorry,
classify,
may I interrupt, Tanmay?
please, please, yeah.
But it's if you can go back to the last slide. But isn't it also true that while they regulate, ocean currents regulate what's happening in the oceans, but they also regulate what's happening on land in terms of
Absolutely,
the
yeah.
seasons and yeah. Okay.
Yeah, 100%. Seasons, rainfall, oxygen, all these things. Yeah, not just oceans, for sure. Yeah. So, for convenience, we have a very broad classification of the zonation of the seabed or how the marine system is classified. So we have the intertidal zone, which is the landmass closest to the shore, which is which is exposed to tidal cycles. So it's exposed during the low tide and submerged during the high tide. And as we go further away, we have the continental shelf, which further drops down all the way to uh, to the deep sea. The shelf is quite large in mainland systems like the west coast and the east coast of India, but it's extremely narrow in island systems. Yeah. So plants and animals that live on the seabed, irrespective of the depth, are referred to as benthic organisms, and animals that live in the water column are referred to as pelagic organisms. And all these animals, based on where they are found, have evolved adaptations that let them survive in those systems. For example, animals in the intertidal have a very high tolerance to temperature changes because the region is exposed to direct sunlight during low tides. Similarly, animals which live in the deeper ocean have, like, quite fascinating adaptations. And the more we get into it, the more bizarre it gets. So I'll just stop there. But the pelagic zone is broadly classified into the photic and the aphotic zones. The photic zones is where we have sunlight penetrating, where we find most of our commonly seen species, high diversity. And as we go deeper, all the way up to 10,000 meters, 11,000 meters, we see animals which are adapted to living in conditions which are entirely devoid of light. Yeah, so despite this zonation seeming, fairly broad, we still have very unique ecosystems found, across most coastal areas. So uh, the marine system which is nearest to the shore, I mean, nearest to terrestrial systems, I would say, are sand dunes, which are essentially formed by the action of wind and sand flowing. Then you have plants that colonize these areas and form very dynamic but also quite resilient structures which give a lot of protection to coastal communities. I'm going to run through this fairly quickly. Okay, so if you guys have any questions about any of these systems, please feel free to ask. As we go closer to the shore, we see systems that all of us are familiar with: the rocky intertidal and sandy shores, which most of us have seen, most of us have visited, but have also been a source of resources for coastal communities for a really long time, for animals like clams, crabs, oysters, lobsters, all these animals. Ecosystems become far more uh, advanced or far more diverse as we go further in towards the water column. So we have mangrove systems which are found nearly all across islands, all across India. And for those who might not know, mangroves are plants which have the ability to survive in saline environments, right? So in places where there is a freshwater influx, we find mangrove forests practically along the entire coast of India. And when we go further deeper, we have systems like seagrass ecosystems and algal beds, which are, and also coral reefs found in uh, shallow regions of the seafloor where there is very high sunlight penetration, which these animals require to survive. Now, what a lot of these ecosystems do, apart from obviously, being home to a very high diverse community of plants and animals, is that they provide a very important uh, sort of a protective barrier to coastal systems, right? We know we have enough evidence pointing towards mangroves and coral reefs preventing the impact of cyclonic surges, tsunamis on coastal communities. So they're playing a fairly direct role in safeguarding these systems. And their importance is even more strongly felt in island systems where the coastline is small, right? So, in the absence of these barriers, we run the risk of seawater entering further inland and mixing with your groundwater resources, which could potentially make most island systems close to uninhabitable, right? We are seeing seawater mixing with freshwater in a lot of islands in the Indo Pacific, and also, if I'm not wrong, in some parts of the Lakshadweep archipelago. The deeper we go and the further we go from the coast, ecosystems and adaptations become far more bizarre. So the deep sea is like an entire environment of its own, where animals have some fascinating adaptations, right? Like these are animals which survive in practically no light. So we see blind fishes, we see fishes with very high temperature tolerances, and so on. And interestingly, all these systems over a period of time have been a source of resources for coastal communities. But what makes marine systems quite interesting is despite us labeling them as A, B, C, and D, they are actually very closely tied to each other, right? So, for example, the healthiest of coral reefs are found in places where we find the healthiest mangrove ecosystems. And the reason behind this is the fact that mangroves provide a very effective barrier to sediment. So there's no soil and terrestrial runoff entering land, which is perfect, entering the water, which is, a perfect environment for animals like corals to grow, which require clear waters. Similarly, the deep sea is very strongly dependent on nutrients that trickle down from shallower waters. So there's this constant energy and nutrient exchange that's happening between all these systems. But beyond that, what is really interesting is the way different animals have been using these systems for a while. So when we talk about any marine systems or the resource use from any marine systems, it's important to understand the way animals use these resources. So this is an example of the life cycle of a giant grouper, or the Goliath grouper, which lives primarily in coral reef areas. This is probably one of the largest groupers, and we also find it in the Andamans and Lakshadweep, so protected species. But this life cycle is fairly similar across most kinds of groupers. So what these animals do is that they live in coral reefs for a major chunk of their lives, but when they have to reproduce, they move to deeper stretches of the water column, right? And they undergo a process called spawning, where the males and females release their gametes, fertilization happens, and eggs are formed. So the reason why an animal is migrating from a coral reef to a slightly deeper part of the ocean is because the currents can then carry these eggs to different places, right? Now, the moment these eggs hatch and the larvae are released from the eggs, the first thing these larvae do is they go near the coast where they find protection, which is typically in mangrove ecosystems, the roots of mangroves or seagrasses, where it's very hard for predators to, um hunt these fishes down. And as they grow larger, they are moving back to the reef, and this cycle continues. So this flow between different marine systems is not restricted just to nutrients, but also to the movement of various animals. The same with prawns, and I'm using these examples because groupers, prawns, all these are commercially important species. But this holds true for a lot of animals, which we uh, some of which we probably don't even know, right? So something very similar happens with prawns, where uh, they lay their eggs on the sandy seabed. The eggs hatch, the larvae go through different scales. Then these animals move to estuaries, right, where they have more food but also a lot of protection. And as they grow, same as groupers, they come back to their original habitat. Interestingly, this links applies to a lot of animals together, right? So we have links not just within marine systems, but also across terrestrial and marine systems. So you have birds which are dependent on marine sources. You have some mammals which are dependent on marine sources, and most importantly, and something which we very frequently, tend to ignore, is the fact that humans are also a very integral part of these systems, right? uh, Very often have we alienated ourselves from marine ecosystems, looked at ourselves as something separate, which is only directly dependent on these resources. But more and more newer models of conservation, talk about the fact that we are as much a part of the marine systems as is, say, a shark. Probably a lot more destructive than one, but a part nonetheless. Um, so India, interestingly, because of its geographic position of being close to the equator in the tropics, and also its vast latitudinal expanse, has a phenomenal diversity of marine systems that we find, right? So we find coral reefs all the way from the Gulf of Kutch to the west coast of India, some scattered reefs in Bombay, Goa, Karnataka. And then we find reef systems in the Gulf of Mannar and in the Pak Bay. And one of the largest reef systems that we find in India are the Andaman Nicobar Islands and the Lakshadweep Islands. Interestingly, there's no reefs along the east coast because the Gangetic Delta carries so much sediment and fresh water all the time that the environment is not suitable for coral reefs to grow. Yeah, then we have mangroves lining the entire coast all the way from Gujarat uh, to West Bengal and also in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. But the densest and the most diverse stretches of mangroves are found in the east coast, the Krishna and the Godavari Wildlife Sanctuary in Andhra Pradesh, Bhitarkanika and Chilka Lagoon areas of Odisha, and the Sundarbans, of course, which are one of the world's one of the most largest continuous stretch of mangroves found. We also find quite a few mangrove ecosystems in the Andamans as well. And beyond these, we also find sand dunes along the coast of Andhra Pradesh, along the coast of Tamil Nadu, and some bits of Karnataka and Maharashtra. Basically, the point that I'm trying to make here is uh, the links between systems that we talk about are extremely evident in places like India, where there's a very high diversity of species, and at the same time a very high diversity of different kinds of ecosystems, which is of course a source for a variety of non-commercially important species. Most of these images are from reefs, but also a lot of fishes that we regularly consume, right? And because of the way the Indian coast is structured, we actually find different kinds of fish communities in different places. So in the northeastern region, you will find those fish groups that are more adapted to living in estuarine conditions. So we have the hilsa, we have prawns, and so on. As you go to the islands, the primary resources that we find are groupers and snappers, which are exclusively reef dependent. We find tunas in slightly open ocean areas, and similarly on the west coast, a lot of you are from the west coast. We get a lot of Bombay ducks, we get a lot of sardines, mackerels, and so on, right? Now, based on the kind of resource or the kind of fish that is found in an area, traditional communities have often come up with ways to tap into the resource. Right. For example, in the Andaman Islands, some communities practice spearfishing, in which a fisher dives in the water, uses a spear to catch the kind of fish that he wants, most of which are predators. Right. Similarly, there are a lot of traditional or even modern practices which are considered quite sustainable. But based on this, we have a lot of different fishing gear that have evolved. I won't talk too much about these because this will be covered in a lot more detail in the coming sessions, I believe. But we largely have trawls which target bottom dwelling fishes. We have scenes which target shoaling fish. We have long lines which target large predators like groupers and sharks. We have gill nets which usually target fishes found in the middle of the water column, and we have certain unique fishing techniques like the pole and line technique that is practiced in some parts of the Lakshadweep Islands. Now, how these techniques evolved, how they were introduced, whether they're good, whether they're bad, is has always been up for debate, and we won't get too much into that right now. But what I wanted to stress on here is, as demand for seafood increases, as the population of any country increases, as the power of boats and their ability to uh, stay in the sea increases, we are faced with a situation where we are harvesting a lot more resource than what is being naturally produced, right? So overfishing is quite rampant all over the globe, and even in places even along the Indian coast. And to add to that is the constantly looming threat of climate change, right? So it is now accepted, despite us still having some climate deniers in global politics, unfortunately, it is largely accepted that the Earth is facing more extreme weather events than it ever has. The mean annual temperatures have been going up considerably. And what this does is it really affects marine systems. Coral reefs, for example, undergo this process called bleaching when there's sudden rise of temperatures. And what happens when a coral bleaches is that gradually the entire ecosystem sort of starts collapsing, right? And with the collapse of the ecosystem, we are again running the threat of losing species that are found, the reef losing its ability to protect coasts, incomes being lost, and so on. Climate change also influences the movement of certain fish species, right? So fish are cold-blooded animals, and they are dependent. They cannot regulate their temperatures, regulate their body temperatures, unlike mammals. So the way fishes deal with changes in temperatures is that they move towards colder or move towards deeper parts, right? From the Indian coast, we know that the oil sardine, which was found exclusively along the Malabar coast in the mid 80s to early 90s, over a period of time has spread out and is now found in stretches of Karnataka and even some parts of Maharashtra. Now, what this movement of a fish does is that it not only affects uh, affects the fishing community, which has been historically fishing on that fish source, but it also puts the entire system in in some sort of a confusion, right? What do we fish now? How do we fish the sudden sardine that is happening in these places? And what makes things even complicated in a system in a place like India is that we have multiple species that we harvest. We have multiple gears that are used to harvest these species. And most importantly and quite interestingly, we have people from different social, cultural, and political backgrounds that are part of fishing operations. So, over a period of time, different kinds of regulations. Again, this will be dealt with in much later, and I think in much detail in some of the later presentations. But I just want to touch upon some of the regulations that we see frequently. So we have seasonal closures. So the East Coast and the West Coast both have fishing bans during the monsoon. The East Coast, if I'm not wrong, the ban is from the 15th of April to the 31st of March, and on the West Coast, it's from the 15th of June to the 31st of July, where most fishing operations, most mechanized fishing operations are banned. We have spatial closures to which are meant to protect rights of traditional fishers, right? So essentially, the part close to the shore, say at a 5 kilometer or a 10 kilometer distance, is open only for fishing using traditional crafts. Then we have protected species, we have protected areas, we have size regulations on certain species, we have gear regulations. There are certain fishing gears that are banned, and so on and so forth. But what makes conservation slightly difficult or slightly challenging is the sheer complexity that we have. Like earlier I mentioned, we have multiple species that are being fished, multiple gears that are being used, and people coming from multiple backgrounds, which makes management complex. And to add to that, with threats like climate change, we have an ecosystem which is constantly evolving and an ecosystem that is constantly changing. So uh, there's clearly no one size fits all model for conserving, especially in places like India, and which has made sustainable resource and conservation quite challenging, right? And more models, more and more conservation models believe that involving local communities in making a change is possibly the best way going forward. So with this, I'm actually done with what I was supposed to talk. I'm sorry if this was a little fast, but I just wanted to trail off with this question about where do we go from here, right? We still know vanishingly little about the species that we find in our systems, how they interact, and yet there is a constant need of updating, upgrading the policies that we have for marine resource management. So yeah, that's pretty much it. And I would love to take questions if you'll have any.
Hi, Tanmay. Thank you. That was really, really, really very good. I'm Radhika. I'm from Net India Brief. I just one question. How rigorously are the regulations in fisheries implemented across India? I mean, are they implemented at all, or is this something that is there on the papers and nobody really cares?
Yeah, I wasn't getting into that,
Tanmay,
but
can we take a couple of questions and then move?
sure. Then in that case, I'll just write them. Yeah, sure. I'll take a couple of questions and then.
Hi, Tanmay, it's Ria.
Hi.
Yeah. So, no, I had a question about fish populations. So you talked about like different species that are fished in different parts of the country, and things like mackerel show up repeatedly. Do we know anything about whether these are the same populations of mackerel or they're separate like populations that are being fished, and how maybe fishing in one part of the country affects populations in other parts of the country?
Hi, Tanmay. I'm Steven. I have two questions. You were talking about the cold-bloodedness in the fish, that they can't regulate their blood. So that means whenever they feel a lot cold or hot, they move towards the other direction. So these migrations that are happening due to the climate change, how do they affect or increase this overfishing or the underfishing? Because there might be areas where there will be a lot less fishes than there were earlier. Secondly, I had a question related to the laws. I think most of the laws that a nation state thinks is within the paradigm of terrestrial laws. So are they sufficient for thinking for a aqueous and polyvocal relationship? Because sea is not a terrain of a particular state or something, because it is not contained in a geography. It is more aqueous in nature. Second, and sub part of this second question is that when we think about human migrations, we are very much concerned that this kind of urban to rural, rural to urban, and then international migration. But what about these kind of migrations where we are thinking very less about, which have a dynamic set of consequences due to which? So these were my two
Sorry, I
questions.
didn't get the migration question, but could you just?
When we think about human migration, we think a lot about policies, that there are a lot of people coming in and going out. While these migrations which are happening within the sea ecosystem are causing much more consequences to the world. Are you getting my?
Yeah.
I think
Did
so.
you get that?
I think so. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Do anyone else have questions? Stevenson, Jones, Madan, Uday? No. Okay. Tanmay, can you stop that share screen?
Oh,
And
sorry. Yeah.
you can take the set of questions.
Yes. So our regulations followed is actually quite interesting. The simple answer would be not very effectively. But so, for example, when we have seasonal closures on the East Coast, we know fishers from the West Coast come to the East Coast and fish. Or in places that are restricted for traditional crafts, there is enough evidence of motorized and mechanized crafts fishing. So regulations are not very directly followed. Yes, but also some regulations are very hard to follow. For example, having if there is a law which says do not catch this fish, it's really difficult for the fisher, who is mostly operating a non-selective fishing gear, to distinguish between what they are catching and what they're not. So yeah, just to answer, I mean, a very quick answer would be it's not followed very strictly. Or another reason for it is also the fact that the coast is also quite hard to monitor, right? So that, I hope that answers it. It's just something that will keep coming up in the coming session. So I think you'll get a much better idea there about regulations. And is that okay, Radhika?
Yeah, Tanmay, go ahead.
Yeah. Second was about fish populations, and yeah, so far we don't know about different fish populations of the same species existing along the coast. Uh, there is some research currently happening on those lines to see whether these populations differ, and if they actually do differ, then it has massive implications on the way fisheries is managed. But as far as I know, we still don't know for sure if these populations differ, but there is a general understanding that there might be differences.
Sorry, can I just
Please,
add
please
in
go
over
ahead.
there?
Yeah,
Um,
sure.
I mean, just regarding fish population or fish stock, and of course, if you look at different species, then you get an understanding that in terms of populations, their numbers, the other variable is their life cycle, but also kind of their range. I think somebody mentioned about transboundary kind of stock. Like, for instance, if you compare a grouper, which is the life cycle that Tanmay had given an example of, which lives on the reef, and the giant grouper is about 40 years, right? Like average uh, li- um,
Yeah,
life cycle, I
possibly
think.
more. Yeah.
Yeah, and but if you look at tuna, which doesn't live on the reef, it's a more of a pelagic stock, and its migration range is far. Its life cycle is about, I think, 4 to 8 years or something like that. So, in terms of how quickly that stock, if it's, say, suppose overfished, there's in some species their capacity to regenerate is quicker, you would say, than in other species. So if you take off a population of grouper, it would take that many number of years for it to come back, as opposed to a tuna which could regenerate a bit faster. I mean, this is all um, in terms of in theory, but of course there are many other variables that affect the potential of a species to come back or not.
Absolutely, absolutely. Uh, yeah, I was talking more about a single species of fish having different genetic populations of sorts. But yeah, what Savita said is like 100% true. Um, the next question was cold-blooded species and how the migration happens. So the migration towards the poles or towards deeper waters is a gradual change, right? It's not something that's happening over short time scale. So as temperatures rise, species move over a period of time. Now, interestingly, what this does to the marine system is that it is removing a species from one area, which can, in most cases, get colonized by more generalist species, which may or may not be important in terms of their commercial value. What it also does is that it adds species in another ecosystem where it wasn't already existing. Yeah, and whether it leads to overfishing or underfishing would very likely depend on the kind of fish that is moving and the kind of fishing that is practiced in that particular area. But it can lead to either, right? A sudden increase in resource at a new place can lead to overfishing. I mean, we really don't know about fish movements in across the Indian coast and how fishing would affect that. There's only evidence of mackerels and the sardine moving. So whether it will lead to overfishing or underfishing is probably something that, yeah, probably something that needs to be looked into 100%. The next thing was about forest related laws, and that is 100% to most natural resource regulation in India has been forest centric, and we don't have marine. I mean, we do have marine regulations, but uh, not as rigorous as the terrestrial regulations that we have. For example, protected area networks, which is a widely followed concept in terrestrial systems, may or may not always work in marine areas, right? Because at the end of the day, the resource dependence is very high, right? We need to keep in mind that fish is probably the only source of natural protein that we are still harvesting from the wild, right? Everything else we eat comes from some sort of cultured groups. So, yeah, we definitely don't have adequate marine centric laws, and marine centric laws need to take into account the people aspect in any regulations. It can't be top down. You can't go to a place and say, okay, from no fishing from tomorrow. Probably now not how it works. But there are, I think, marine fishing laws also seem to be evolving with times as well. So, Savita, Was there something you
Yeah, I
wanted to say?
just wanted to also add that it's not just sort of resource management kind of laws that we take from terrestrial or land-based systems. Even in the case, and I'm sure this will become a debate at some point during the next few days, is about the coastal rights. How do we approach coastal rights? And because we've had a history of legislation, the forest rights, and that legislation got passed and it has a certain history. There is, of course, a tendency to borrow from those learnings in when we talk about coastal rights. And so the question is, how much of it can we learn from, and how much of it sort of doesn't apply, because they're totally different systems and contexts in that case. So that is the other thing to sort of keep in mind. Maybe I'm sure Anil will talk about it quite a lot at some point.
Do we have another round of questions? If so, Jones has, Radhika has, who else has questions? Jones will have to come here. You just tell it over here. So they want to, they will have to.
Two things. One thing is that during your reply, you said that fishers has to use target-oriented nets, gears. The gear is not target-specific. If we use target-specific gears, it will be mono hunt. That will also lead to overfishing. One thing. Second question which Madan was asking is that every year there is in the Matsya Sampada, every year they are giving targets like 2 million metric ton this year. The government has been given targets, fish production, million tons. So what does the government says? That the presentation says that fishers are doing overfishing. And the gears which you showed.
No. That's sorry. I'm sorry if it came across that way. That's not what I meant.
He says he's also saying that when everybody says overfishing, it comes to the fishers. It is not you. In the overfishing, it comes to the fishers.
Absolutely.
But the government gives the target of harvesting more and more fishes with their policies. Yeah. The gears which you showed also is promoted by the government, not specific
100%.
gears, traditional gears which fishers use. So how to address in this context? So that was his question. Because we are not specific.
Sorry, could you please?
How should one repeat that last point once again?
So he's saying that government is having targets, metric tons. So how to handle this situation in conservation? When you talk about conservation, how to handle this?
Exactly.
Just a second. There are I forgot to also say that among the participants there are active fish workers also.
I read the parts.
So that's one. So can you take one more question? Jason, you want to ask a question? Okay. Jason also has a similar question. Radhika has one more question. You can take that set of questions after Radhika says, yeah?
Sure.
A very quick question. The aqua farms, the pisciculture that is happening, how is that affecting the landscape, the water and the quality of the water, and how is it affecting the fish that is not being aqua farmed? And how much regulation is there in the aqua farm industry, if at all?
Yeah, Tanmay, go ahead.
Yeah. So to answer the first question, yes. I mean, I'm again, like, that's not what I intended when I said overfishing. It is, like you said, it is government, giving targets, government subsidizing certain kinds of gears, which, have been proven to be a lot more destructive than traditional practices, which overfishing is a consequence of that. But to address or to manage some of these things is what I was talking about towards the later part of the presentation. Like, most models of sustainably managing resources need to take into account the people involved in it, right? Because the challenge here is securing livelihoods and also safeguarding populations. So increasingly, there's more and more focus on bottom-up approaches, which involve members of the fishing community, practitioners, and so on, from where we build up to creating policies such that, they are beneficial for all, as opposed to having a more top-down policy, which usually leads to a lot of conflict and, and doesn't really serve the purpose. So yeah, increasing participation in monitoring, increasing representation of the fishing communities in any of these policy makings is would probably be an ideal way to strike the balance between extraction and conservation. Uh, the next one was about aquaculture. Yeah, so I don't know so much about aquaculture, but there has been an increasing impetus to increase the aquaculture production in India, which has been growing quite a bit in the last decade or so. The problem with aquaculture uh, is that it is taking up areas which were earlier natural systems. Like a lot of mangroves have been converted to aquaculture lands, a lot of salt marshes and a lot of other coastal systems have been converted to aquaculture land, which is never good. There's also the possibility of introducing species which have not been historically found in that area, leading to population explosions of potentially invasive species in ecosystems. The other thing that it does is it sort of I mean, I don't know how to phrase it, but essentially fishing is a very specialized activity, right? Only uh, those who have been doing it for, it has a lot of cultural, a lot of social value to it. Aquaculture seems more like uh, like it's just the commercial side of it, So beyond the ecological uh, and environmental implications, I feel it also has a lot of social and cultural implications, which we quite often ignore in any kind of, policies or interventions. But honestly, I don't know much about aquaculture, so I would suggest.
I'll just add that. Sorry if I don't
Please,
know if
please, Savita.
Tanmay, if you've already mentioned, but in many parts, where you have aquaculture that is near shore, you have a lot of runoff from the farms because either they're using some of the tidal influence sort of creeks to which have connected to these farms, and so there's a lot of pollution runoff that goes into the nearshore waters, and fishers have talked about how that has really depleted the stock that is near shore, because the fish are sort of no longer there because of that kind of pollution. But of course, like Tanmay said, there are a range of issues connected to aquaculture that needs to be talked about. We can no longer talk about fisheries now in India in as marine fisheries in isolation. We have to talk about what aquaculture is also doing, and how the dynamics of that actually affects marine fisheries as well. So I think there must be uh, copies of a report that we've sort of put together called Occupation of the Coast. I'm sure it's around. So do take a look at that as well.